My name is Juliet Anderson, and I am 28 years old. The first time my father publicly branded me a liar, I was 7. We were gathered around my aunt's birthday table, and I accidentally tipped over a glass of juice. I told him it slipped from my fingers. He scanned the faces of every relative seated at that table and announced, "She always has an excuse, never once takes responsibility." The room laughed. I sat frozen. That single moment embedded itself somewhere deep inside me, a quiet, unshakable realization that, regardless of what I said or how I said it, my parents had already constructed a version of me inside their minds. And for the next 21 years, I exhausted myself trying to dismantle it. I dressed the way they preferred. I chose every word with precision. I offered apologies for things that were never my fault. I reshaped myself into someone I barely recognized, all in pursuit of a love that kept moving further away the closer I got. Then Callum Reed entered my life. He was 31, a civil engineer with a calmness that ran all the way through him, in his hands and in his character. We crossed paths at a rooftop fundraiser 3 years ago. He had come for a colleague. I had come for a client. Within 4 minutes of our introduction, he knocked his drink onto my jacket and apologized with such genuine embarrassment that I found myself laughing instead of tensing up. By the time the evening ended, we had swapped numbers and shared a conversation that felt like taking the first real breath after years of holding one in. He never needed me to shrink. He never flinched when I spoke directly. He asked me things and actually listened while I answered. After 14 months together, he proposed in the kitchen of our apartment. No elaborate setup, no theatrical reveal, just him lowering to one knee with a ring his grandmother had passed down, his voice catching slightly when he said my name. I said yes before he could finish asking. We chose a Saturday in late September for the wedding. The rehearsal dinner was booked for the Friday evening before at a restaurant called Brennan's, a private room filled with candlelight and the people who mattered most to us, gathered to mark something I had spent my entire life longing for, being genuinely chosen by someone. My parents had never warmed to Callum. My father, Leonard, considered him too reserved, too understated, someone who failed to register on the internal scorecard he carried everywhere. My mother, Patricia, kept a smile fixed on her face whenever Callum was present and waited until he stepped away to speak her real thoughts. I had spent years learning how to tune them out. I had developed a kind of internal filter. But 14 days before the wedding, they did something no filter could catch. Callum phoned me on a Tuesday afternoon, and something in his voice was off. Not cold, not hostile, just careful, like someone carrying something breakable and unsure how tightly to hold it. He told me my parents had appeared at his office unannounced, without a word to me. They had sat across from him and told him that I had been pregnant at 22, that I had delivered a baby and then walked away from that child without a second glance. My father used a word so ugly, I still flinch remembering it. My mother leaned in close to Callum as though sharing a secret between friends and said, "Don't let her trap you the same way." Callum did not raise his voice. He did not come at me with accusations. He simply asked if there was something I had been meaning to tell him. I was sitting alone in my car in a parking garage, phone pressed to my ear, and I felt something inside my chest give way completely. Because there had been a pregnancy. And the truth was nothing like the version my parents had handed him. When I was 22, I had been in a relationship with a man named Sebastian Cole. He was older and possessed a charm that was really just manipulation in better packaging. I became pregnant. I was frightened and uncertain, and Sebastian made it abundantly clear that he wanted no part of it. Every time I tried to think through what I wanted, he found a way to make the space around that decision smaller and smaller, until I could barely stand in it. I carried the pregnancy for 4 months before a miscarriage ended it, sudden and devastating, completely beyond my control. There was no birth. There was no living child I had turned my back on. There was grief, heavy and silent, that I had buried so completely I had never spoken of it to almost anyone, Callum included, because I had never been able to find the right moment, and because that season belonged to a version of myself I had spent years gently putting to rest. My parents were aware of all of this. They had been present. My mother had driven me to the hospital herself. She had sat beside me in the waiting room and held my hand. She knew precisely what had happened and precisely what had not. And 14 days before my wedding, she sat across from my future husband and told him I had abandoned a living child. That evening, I drove to Callum's apartment and told him everything: the pregnancy, the miscarriage, Sebastian, the silence I had carried across years. He sat completely still through all of it. When I finished, he reached across the table and closed his hand around mine and said, "I am so sorry that happened to you." Not, "I'm sorry you kept it from me." Not, "I'm not sure what to believe." He mourned it alongside me before he asked a single question. That was the man I had said yes to. But the damage my parents had deliberately seeded was still present in the room with us, and I knew it would not dissolve simply because Callum was a good person. They had understood that. A carefully placed doubt, dropped close enough to a wedding day, has the potential to fracture something that even genuine love cannot fully restore. What they had not anticipated was who would step through a door the following Friday evening, and what she would have in her hands when she did. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be a gentle prelude to the most important day of my life. Brennan's had been transformed into something luminous, amber light washing across exposed brick walls, long tables in cream linen with eucalyptus running down their centers, candle flames catching in glass vessels and scattering soft light across the faces of the people we loved. Callum stood near the bar with his brother, both of them, his collar loose, his eyes drifting to find me across the room the way they always did, the way that always made me feel like something real. Standing in the doorway in my navy dress, I almost convinced myself that the previous 2 weeks had not occurred, that the wound had already begun to close. My parents were seated at the far end of the table. My father was into his second drink. My mother wore a pale rose blouse and the particular expression she reserved for occasions where cameras might appear, pleasant and composed, performing a version of herself for people who had not spent a lifetime watching the performance. They had attempted to call twice after the confrontation with Callum. I had not picked up. They had shown up that evening because I had not yet summoned the exact words to rescind their invitation, and because some worn-out corner of me had held out hope they would simply be quiet and let the night pass undisturbed. That hope ended at 8:17 in the evening when the door to the private room opened and a woman walked in whom I had not seen in 6 years. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 34, composed and precise, with dark eyes and the particular steadiness of someone who had come through something difficult and kept going. She had been my closest friend during the years I spent with Sebastian Cole. She had held me together through the miscarriage with a quiet consistency I had never properly acknowledged. We had drifted apart in the years since, not through any conflict, simply through the gradual way that sometimes happens when two people carry the same difficult memory and find that stepping away from each other makes it easier to move forward. I had not known she was coming. I had not sent her an invitation. In the first few seconds of seeing her cross the room, I could not begin to understand what had brought her there. She came straight to me, skipped the pleasantries entirely, and said my name in a tone that was controlled but carried weight. She was holding a manila envelope. She told me she needed 5 minutes and that it could not wait. I brought her into the narrow corridor outside the dining room, the sounds of the gathering dulled behind the closed door, and she placed the envelope in my hands and told me to open it. Inside were documents, medical records from the hospital where I had been treated, a discharge summary with a date printed clearly across the top, a letter from the physician who had attended me, formal and thorough, confirming the pregnancy loss at 17 weeks. And beneath those, a series of printed text message screenshots, time-stamped and legible, exchanged between my mother, Patricia Anderson, and Sebastian Cole. The earliest message was from 3 months prior. In it, my mother had contacted Sebastian herself. She had asked him to confirm, if the question ever arose, that I had delivered a living child and placed it for adoption without his knowledge. Sebastian, to whatever credit remained in him, had declined. He had told her plainly that was not what had happened, and that he had no intention of being involved. My mother had tried twice more. He had stopped responding entirely. Nora had come to know all of this because Sebastian, disturbed by the exchange, had reached out to her. They had remained loosely connected over the years, and she had driven 4 hours to make certain I had those papers before I stood at any altar. I remained in that corridor for a long moment with the documents in my hands, and something very still happening somewhere inside me. It was not anger exactly. It was something that predated anger, something more complete. It was the specific, hollow grief of receiving confirmation for something you have always known, but never been able to prove. That your parents were not simply damaged or frightened, but methodical and deliberate in a cruelty that had nothing to do with loving you and everything to do with keeping you in a shape they could manage. I walked back into the dining room. Callum read my expression before I had said a word and moved to stand at my side without being asked. I placed the envelope on the table directly in front of my mother and my father, in front of every guest seated at that table, in front of the candlelight and the eucalyptus and the beautiful room that had been built to hold only joy. I did not raise my voice. I had spent too many years screaming into silence to squander the quiet I had finally earned. I told everyone present, clearly and without theatrics, exactly what the documents contained. I told them what my parents had tried to do 14 days before my wedding. My father's jaw went tight. My mother studied the tablecloth. Neither of them produced a single word. I asked them to leave. They did. The room held a silence that stretched long enough to feel complete. Then Callum's mother, a woman named Frances, who had extended nothing but warmth to me from the very beginning, rose from her seat and began to applaud. Slowly at first, and then every person at that table joined her, and I stood in the amber glow of Brennan's with my soon-to-be husband's hand in mine, and Nora across the room watching me through eyes that had gone glassy. And I let the sound of that applause move through every year I had ever spent being called a liar, in rooms where nobody came to my defense. We married that Saturday. The ceremony was intimate, honest, and entirely ours. My parents were absent. That was not a loss. That was a line I had stopped making excuses for having drawn. Callum's voice broke during his vows. I waited for him to finish before mine broke through my own. Nora sat in the front row and produced a tissue at exactly the right second, the way she always had known how to do. I am Juliet Anderson, soon to become Juliet Reed, and I am 28 years old. I spent the majority of those years operating under the belief that the two people most obligated to love me without condition had simply received a version of me that warranted something lesser. I understand now that was never once the truth. Some people do not stop attempting to control you because they have grown or changed. They stop because you finally place yourself far enough beyond their reach and build something so grounded and so true that their words no longer have any surface to land on. If any part of this story landed somewhere real inside you, if you have ever been in a room where someone dismantled your truth and everyone around you stayed quiet, I want you to understand something. The rehearsal dinner is not the conclusion of your story. Sometimes it is the precise moment where the one that actually matters begins. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to this channel. Every story shared here is intended for someone who needed it on exactly this day. Hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and return for the next one, because the chapters worth reading are always still ahead.